One of my earliest memories, my father was a teacher, and it seemed he always had these red pencils that the school board issued in his pockets. And I remember, and I must have been truly an infant because I wasn't mobile, pulling this red pencil out of his pocket. Because these pencils were always around, and I used them. But I had this inclination, I think two things, maybe not different than anyone else, but I remember being very visual. I was always looking at things, and particular things that interested me, that still do. Birds and animals, and just looking out of windows at trees, at the hills, at the mountains, the Olympics across the strait in Victoria. Those are things I was always looking at. And I think the family was that way inclined, because we'd be out for a Sunday drive or something, suddenly had to stop the car and look at something. A new view of Mountain Baker or something. And so it was just, it was very normal. When we say elementary, the early years depended so much on the instructor, and it wasn't as benevolent at time. Teachers were often quite terrifying, but some were more kindly and some were more inclined to give one. I was generally given credit for doing things well. But I remember once we were to do a crayon thing, as in grade 2, of the Olympic mountains. And I would see them, with the kind of trees and green on the bottom and mucky. And I was made to stand in the corner because I didn't do these nice, perfect little kind of purple cones with little white tufts on top, because I'd never seen a mountain that really looked like that. So I was trying to do the mountain the way I saw it. So I learned very quickly, you don't do that at school. So you sort of learn to do this kind of thing. But my inclination was always to, if I drew trees, it was never a ball on a stick, ever. It was always to draw the leaves and the branches. Possibly put apples on it, because my aunt had apple trees in her orchard. And so it was really that kind of thing. And I like to do animals, like I fell in the lake in Beacon Hill Park in Victoria looking at a duck. Fortunately, there was a gardener there who grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and pulled me out. And it didn't bother me very much, but I remember very much the ducks, the way their feathers sort of grew out of their heads, the wood ducks particularly, and the rings around their necks and all these things. So I saw things always in detail and interest, and I wanted to put it down. Then when I went to junior high school, suddenly we had art as a course. And I had a very good teacher, very, very, very nice fellow, and very encouraging. And at that time, I was about 12. And then when we went on to senior high school, I had an excellent woman teacher, excellent art teacher. And I really, really thank Frances Cameron. I think she directed my life a great deal. Their encouragement, I just sort of, this is what I was going to do. No, it was, family decided I was going to do at least a year of university, so I did a year of university. Again, it was college, but it was a first-year university. And then I was quite lost for a while. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I just took one job and another job, worked here, worked there, left this and that. And there was a sign. I was walking along the street in Victoria that said art classes, and Herbert Siebner had come from Berlin, and he was setting up a studio in Victoria. And so I went upstairs to look, and I decided I liked this, and then I began taking lessons. Extra. And I'd also done some earlier with Jan Zak and Ina Uthoff, who was a Victoria artist. They were all very helpful, very helpful. So I did have a fair bit of training, but I found Herbert was probably the most influential, and in as much that I stayed with him for a couple of years. And then I felt I really wanted to make this my life, not something I did after work at a job I didn't want to do anyway. So I went to art school in Vancouver. I always liked to draw, but somehow it took on more and more significance as I went through my years of art school. And then after art school, when we moved, I was with my partner then, and we moved out of Vancouver as such, and lived in North Vancouver, which was really very, very rural, inland valley. And I was fascinated with the mountains, and there's suddenly this new environment. But it was such a different landscape than anything, I'd studied in art school. And I'm not an Emily Carr. And in that, oh God, how to put this, because I'm trying to think. I wasn't inclined to work in the form of the Group of Seven, which was very much, they rebelled against the tyranny, really, of their time, but created, I feel, their own tyranny. That Canadian art looks like Group of Seven. And it wasn't my inclination to work like that. I saw things differently. And I think it was in Lynn Valley, this began to happen. I was basically trying to draw like Bruegel, for goodness sake. I mean, I think that's what happened. But probably there was a certain significance in the connection of things. And just drawing this mass of undergrowth and mountains, the wild, really very wild country that North Vancouver is. And I think that changed things a great deal. And each place we moved to after that, we moved further up Indian Arm, and I'd take my boat out and go out in my rowboat with my dog on the bow to hold it down, which is a good thing. He couldn't swim, poor thing, though. And and I had a seagull engine on the back of it, and I'd go up and down the inlet and sort of anchor the boat and take a raft to paddle to shore and work on the shore, and till my day was done, then paddle back in my raft, load the dog and so on. It was quite an expedition. But I worked that way, and for 2 years we lived there. And my trying to say is, whatever my environment is, I'm drawn to it in the imagery that I create, but that I make in the drawings that I do. Relate very much to my environment of the time. We moved to Richmond, and again, it was working from the dikes and this very, very open country. So extremely different from North Vancouver. It was like going into another world. When we left Richmond, we moved to Oyama. The idea that we would have an orchard. And we would live from the orchard, but I like apples. I love apples, but I don't like picking apples all day. And it was not my calling at all, and my partner felt the same. So we decided we would move to something that was actually more rural than Oyama. And we found this particular property, the property itself, the houses and so on, we didn't think much of, but the view is spectacular. And that's what I look at. Then I think, the house, yes, it needs a little repair. And so that's how we actually moved there. And then we're still there. Put it that way. Well, I hand sharpened the pencil. I still have the knife, which I acquired when I was at art school. It is truly an antique thing. It's wonderful. It's one of these utility knives, but it's heavy metal thing. And I think the weight of it gives it a great balance, because it's just super for sharpening my pencils. And it's quite time-consuming. The sharpening in itself is, quite a task. And I'll sort of wrap them in bundles and hit them sort of upright, so I'm not going to break them on the way out, because the worst thing you can do is, if your pencil's all sharpened, and drop the box or something, because I have to have them very, very sharp. Well, I sort of, seek places out. As soon as something really attracts me or draws me, draw it. And I find these particular areas, you've got to know them, and it's always changing. The growth changes, trees come down, trees grow up, all that sort of thing makes quite a difference. Plus, my interest of the times will change, of course, too. It's sort of hard to describe. The assumed way is you work from the general to the particular. Well, I don't. I work more particular and establish the general afterwards, but it's from very often small things, sort of a nucleus of something that grows, and it is rather almost feeling like you look up the branches and on the leaves and the twigs, and the same thing, sort of the sky things. You almost feel these clouds and the way they push on the mountains, and the mountains almost move. It's and the more I get into the drawing, you realize there's more and more activity. What would appear to be a very could I say, a very still environment, but suddenly it is so animated. And you find all these things as they work, sort of drawn more and more into that particular subject or situation. Now, what do we? Well, first of all, as I mentioned with the ducks, I liked drawing animals when I was a youngster. I was very horsey, and I loved drawing horses. Horses were, in a way, a part of the environment because the bread didn't come in a truck. The baker, the bread came to the house, and it came in a little wagon, and the horse pulled the wagon. The same with the milk, various things. So horses were always there. And then I had riding lessons when I was young, and so we went out to the horses. And this was very much part of it, because I drew them constantly. And it was, finally and later, when I was sort of in my teens, and it was that the dread of becoming like a horse specialist, you really wouldn't be an artist because you find a way to do something. And this is quite true. So it was basically through my teaching with Zach particularly, that you don't see things in a set way. You see them more as volume in space, because Zach was a sculptor. And I think that was a very significant part of my learning. Sometimes you're told a lot of things that don't really make too much sense. But this really connected with me as seeing something almost without a label. It was a form in space to be sort of discovered and depicted. And once it started, I moved away from one specific thing because you're no longer a specialist in a particular department. You basically knew nothing about anything and you draw to learn. And when I moved more and more inclined to drawing than painting, simply because I found I could see more through drawing. I could discover more through drawing. It was for me very, very exploratory, and felt the importance of being able to go to something and continue working from it, go back to it again and again. I went on, when I really became absolutely engrossed with landscape, was when I took actually a motor trip with my aunt around in the early, middle 50s, I think it was. No, pardon me, late 50s. And I was suddenly looking at this incredible landscapes through the American Midwest, onto Yellowstone and into South Dakota. And I kept thinking, and my aunt was very tolerant. We'd stop the car and I could make sketches and so on. This was great. But I thought if I could ever just be somewhere where I could study this thing, and this scene, this mountain, this situation, and draw it over and over and learn more about it. It just felt too light, too passing through, and not enough focus on it. So when we moved to Lynn Valley, that's when I really became aware of the place you return to day after day, and you learned more about it and discovered more about it. And it just became a part of my way of working, no matter where I went. So when I went to Falkland, this was part of it. And you mentioned the goats. I'm kind of prattling a bit, but as it comes up, the drawing animals was very, very part of my early thing. And even when I was at art school, I'd spend more time at the zoo than in the class, because I found really the cougars and the ostriches and things were far more interesting to draw than somebody sitting there in a G-string. It really wasn't, to me, that exciting an experience, or pots and pans and these dreadful still lifes you had to draw. They're very sterile. So that didn't always go over too well. But that's sort of where my interest in drawing from animals came from. And when we moved, I think the fact that when we moved to Oyama, I had a place I could put a larger thing. Until then, it was like we'd get chickens. I used to borrow them from the zoo when I was at art school living in the West End and take them back again. And I had got lizards. I remember getting an iguana to draw, and and another iguana. They didn't survive too well. And cages of birds. So I finally could get something bigger. And I wanted the idea of an animal with horns and hooves. I thought this would be very exciting. And it was decided a cow would be too big. So we looked for a goat. And so I had quite a time finding a goat that had horns, as I wanted, that really, because people practically removed the horns. And so I finally found my goat after going up and down the valley. And so I worked from it for a full winter, and outside at that time in a shed, and drawing the single goat. There were pen drawings. And then the goat had the family, and then I found other goats, and generally we ended up with 6 or 8 of them most of the time, pets. I can't say more than that. Generally they say, well, you raise goats, you're sort of a goat. No, they were pets. And I drew them. And then periods I didn't, and periods that I did. But the idea of the herd came from just the grouping of them and the way they would move. And it had this almost, I think, landscape quality about it. The animals almost fitted into the landscape, into one another, this sort of shifting of, one animal to the next. And I worked from those for several years again, from about 84 to 1990, and about 5 years that they worked. But at that time, only in the summer. And then in the winter, then I was generally working from people. They're quite interchangeable, the way people and... Oh, I'm sure. I think it's formed me totally. I do believe that without doubt. I think there's no question. Because every aspect, really, of my existence is serving my art. You know, what I do, what I don't do, how I begin my day, how I manage my day, everything. It's in a way, it's so, it's so simple. I love to draw. I truly have a passion to draw. I have to draw. I once researched something about dance. I don't know anything about dance. I was forced to ballet as a kid. It was a total loss for all of us. And so it didn't last very long. I don't know, you just have to do it. And it's the dancers, it's not who is the best, but who has to. And I think that's with most anything, and sometimes people that really have to struggle for something, it doesn't necessarily come easily, but it's meaningful enough that you will struggle. Because I never find it easy. I was considered blah, blah, blah talented, but I so deviated from that sort of path of doing nice things that were talented to not so nice things that I was struggling to grapple with. And so I think that's far, far more important. First of all, that you see something in the first place, and really feel it's so desperate that you going to sit and be very uncomfortable